The warm air was what she noticed first, and it rose from the root cellar opening in December of 1861 like a visible argument. She had opened the hatch to get turnips, and the warm air had come up around her face in a column she could feel against her cold cheeks, and she had stood there with the hatch open longer than was necessary to get turnips, because she was thinking about what the warm air meant and where it had come from and what it implied about a problem she had been trying to solve since October. The problem was the cabin. Specifically, the problem was the cold in the cabin, which was a particular kind of cold that she had come to understand through observation as different in character from the cold of a room that has no fire. A room with no fire gets cold uniformly as the heat dissipates outward through the walls. The cabin she was in got cold from the floor up, a directional cold that moved in from the north and from below, that no amount of fire fully addressed, because the fire heated the air in the room and the cold air infiltrating through every gap in the single-walled board construction replaced the heated air continuously, drawing in from outside at whatever temperature outside it reached, and requiring the fire to heat it again from that temperature to something livable. The fire was always fighting the infiltration. The infiltration was always winning in the sense that it kept coming. The cold outside air finding the gaps in the boarding and the sill joints and the floor edges and flowing in as the warm room air found the upper gaps and flowed out. The classic convective exchange that made single-wall frontier construction in Pennsylvania winters an exercise in burning wood to offset the cold that poured in as fast as the fire could address it. She had been burning 4 cords a month since November. Before November, she had burned 2. The difference was the Pennsylvania cold arriving in earnest, the temperature dropping below 20 degrees and staying there. The infiltration rate increasing with the temperature differential between inside and outside, the fire working constantly to compensate for what the gaps were giving away. Her name was Louisa Henkel Nee Bowman. She was 44 years old, born in Pennsylvania of German parents who had come from Ortenburg in 1816 and who had farmed the same land they arrived on until her father died in 1848 and her mother the following year, and she had married Friedrich Henkel in 1840, and they had farmed together until Friedrich died of the fever in 1859, and she had been managing the 80 acres alone since then, with her son Wilhelm, who was 21 and who had taken work at the Carlisle foundry in 1860, and who sent money home when he could. She had bought the second claim, the 40 acres with the board cabin, in the autumn of 1861 from a man named Oberholt, who needed cash more than land, and who had let it go for the price of 2 seasons of her market garden produce, which was not money but was what she had. The cabin on the Oberholt land was cold in a way her own farmhouse was not, which she had attributed in October to its single-wall construction and had been living with as a problem she was working toward solving with whatever was already on the land. She stood at the root cellar hatch in December with the warm air rising around her face and thought, the ground is warm. It's not warm in the comfortable sense. Warm in the sense of 45 degrees, which she knew from pressing her palm to the root cellar wall in summer and in winter, and finding it the same temperature in both seasons. The ground below the frost line was 45 degrees, and the root cellar was cut into that ground, and the air in the root cellar was 45 degrees. And when she opened the hatch in December, the 45-degree root cellar air met the cold cabin air and rose, because 45 degrees was warmer than December Pennsylvania, and warm air rose. She stood at the hatch and thought about this for 5 minutes, which was longer than the turnips required and shorter than the problem deserved. The cabin was cold because cold outside air was infiltrating through the gaps. The stove was heating the infiltrating cold air from whatever the outside temperature was up to something livable. At December temperatures of 10 above zero, the stove was lifting the infiltrating air from 10 degrees to 60 degrees. A 50-degree lift, burning wood continuously to accomplish it. If the infiltrating air came into the cabin at 45 degrees instead of 10 degrees, the stove would only need to lift at 15 degrees instead of 50. The same fire, the same wood, the same stove, heating the room from 45 rather than from 10. The wood savings would be proportional to the reduction in the lift required. She had not been able to stop the infiltration. She had sealed every gap she could find with clay, which helped but did not solve the problem because the single-walled board construction had gaps at every board joint and at the sill and at the floor edge and at the window frames and at the door frame. And clay in one place meant the infiltration found the next place, and the next place, and the pressure differential between outside cold and inside warm was not something clay could fully block in a structure built the way the Oberholt cabin had been built. But she could change where the infiltrating air came from. She could not stop air from entering the cabin. She could change the temperature at which it entered. She got the turnips and closed the hatch and went back into the cabin and sat at the table and drew a diagram on a piece of paper with a pencil stub. The diagram showed the cabin from the side. The root cellar was 20 feet from the cabin's north wall, on the north side, which was the side from which most of the infiltrating cold arrived. She drew a tube running from a point on the north exterior of the cabin, underground at 4 feet depth. 20 feet to the root cellar entry, with an intake opening above ground on the far end, capped to prevent snow from entering. The tube would bring outside air in through the intake above ground, carry it underground for 20 feet at 4-foot depth where the soil was 45 degrees, and deliver it to the cabin through a hole in the north sill at 45 degrees rather than at whatever the outdoor temperature was. She looked at the diagram for a while. She drew the airflow in at the intake above ground, along the buried section warming as it traveled into the cabin through the north sill. She pressed the tube concept with the same kind of testing she applied to anything before committing to the labor. Would the air flow? The outdoor intake would be exposed to the cold. Cold air descends, warm air rises. Cold air entering the intake above ground would encounter warmer air in the buried section, and the temperature differential would drive the flow. Cold in at the outdoor end, warm out at the cabin end, the same convective pressure that drove air through any chimney. Only in reverse orientation, cold driving into the buried section, as the warmer, underground air was drawn into the cabin by the slightly lower pressure of the room. The flow would happen passively without any mechanical assistance. For the same reason that a conventional chimney drew, temperature differential creating pressure differential creating flow. She put the diagram in the notebook she had been keeping since Friedrich died, the notebook where she had been recording the fuel consumption and the temperature readings she made each morning, and she wrote beneath it, Earth tube air intake, 20 feet at 4 feet depth, inlet capped above grade. Exit through north sill, no moving parts, no fuel. Warms incoming air to near Earth temperature before entry. She spent the rest of December sourcing the materials. The poplar trees at the creek margin on her 80 acres were sufficient for the tube itself. She needed sections of hollow tube approximately 4 inches in interior diameter, and she had 2 options: hollowed poplar logs or fired clay tiles. The clay tiles were the better option for durability and for the sealed joints that would prevent soil infiltration into the air path. But firing clay tiles required a kill she did not have. The poplar logs were the option available without additional equipment. She felled 6 poplar trees of approximately 8-inch diameter and 10-foot length and worked them through the winter, splitting each log lengthwise and gouging the interior channel with an adze and a chisel, cutting each half to match the other, and assembling the paired halves with clay sealed into the joint and lashed with wet rawhide strips that would dry tight. Each 10-foot section of hollowed poplar took 2 days to prepare and produced a tube of approximately 4 inches interior diameter. 2 sections gave her 20 feet of tube. She made 3 because a spare section against breakage during installation was worth the additional labor, and because the 25-foot run she had revised upward to improve the warming time. The air spent underground was possible with 3 sections. The iron pipe she purchased in Carlisle on the February trip she made for supplies. She needed 3 feet of iron pipe of the right diameter for the section through the north sill, where the poplar wood would not provide adequate weather resistance at the transition from underground to thrall, and she needed an iron cap of the right shape for the outdoor intake. The iron pipe and cap cost her $3, which was the price the Carlisle merchant charged and which she paid from the winter butter and egg money. She installed the tube in March of 1862 when the ground had thawed enough for the spade to work at 4 feet depth. She dug the trench starting from the north sill of the cabin, working northward 25 feet toward the root cellar entry, maintaining the 4-foot depth throughout. She laid the 3 poplar sections end to end in the trench bottom, checking each joint for the clay seal before laying the section, and backfilled the trench in layers, tamping each layer before adding the next to minimize settling that would crack the poplar tube under the soil pressure. The iron section she installed through a hole she cut in the north sill at floor level, sealed around the iron pipe with clay pressed tightly from both interior and exterior. The iron pipe extending 6 inches into the interior of the cabin and terminating with an open end, covered by a simple iron grate she made from bent rod to prevent mice from entering the air path from inside. The outdoor intakes she positioned 2 feet above grade 2 prevent snow blockage. The iron cap bent to face downward and away from the prevailing north wind to prevent backdraft. She packed clay around the intake post and let it cure for 2 weeks before the first test. The first test was April 15, 1862. A cold April morning with the outdoor temperature at 22 degrees, frost still on the ground, in the shadows. She crouched at the interior iron grate and held her palm over the opening. Air was moving through it. Not a strong flow, but a continuous movement, the passive convective draw she had predicted from the temperature differential. She held her palm over the grate for 5 minutes and felt the temperature of the air coming through. It was not 45 degrees. It was warmer than 22 degrees, which was the outside temperature. And it was warmer than she had expected for an April test, when the soil at 4 feet had not yet fully reached the summer temperature. She wrote in the notebook, April 15th, first test. Outside 22 degrees. Air at grate, approximately 38 degrees. Tube functioning, passive flow confirmed. Soil at 4 feet, not yet at summer temperature. We'll test again in December when soil temperature's stable and outside cold at full winter level. She tested in December. The outdoor temperature was 8 degrees above zero. The air at the interior grate was 43 degrees. 35 degrees of preheating, provided by 25 feet of buried poplar tube at 4-foot depth, with no fuel and no fire and no moving parts. She recorded, December 12th, outside 8 degrees, air at grate, 43 degrees. 35-degree preheating in 25 feet of buried tube. Stove heating from 43 instead of 8. Fuel consumption this month compared to last December without tuba. She compared the fuel consumption. Last December, without the tube, she had burned 4 cords. This December, with the tube, she burned 2.5 cords. She burned the same amount of wood in the same cabin with the same stove, and the cabin was 3 degrees warmer on average than the previous December. 2.5 cords instead of 4. 3 degrees warmer. Same stove. Same cabin. Buried poplar tube and $3 of iron. She told her neighbor Eliza Mast about the tube in January, because Eliza had been asking about her fuel consumption since October, when she had noticed that Louisa's woodpile was diminishing more slowly than her own. Despite comparable cabins and comparable winters, she told her in the direct way she had always told Eliza things, which was without preamble and with the numbers. Eliza said, "A buried pipe heats your cabin." Louisa said, "It does not heat the cabin. It heats the air before it enters the cabin. The stove heats the cabin from that point forward." Eliza said, "A buried pipe heats the air that heats your cabin." Louisa said, "Yes." Eliza said, "How does a buried pipe heat air?" Louisa said, "The ground at 4 feet is 45 degrees. The air traveling through the pipe for 25 feet picks up heat from the pipe walls from the surrounding soil. The air arrives at the cabin at 43 degrees instead of 8 degrees. Eliza pressed her lips together in the specific expression she used when she was absorbing something that required more time than the conversation allowed. She said, "And you buried this yourself?" Louisa said, "In March. 3 days of digging for the trench, plus a winter of hollowing the poplar sections." Eliza said, "What do the poplar sections cost?" Louisa said, "Nothing. They are from my creek margin. The iron was $3. Eliza sat with this for a moment. She said, "My husband will say it is a woman's fancy." Louisa said, "Show him the fuel numbers from my November and December." Eliza showed him. He came to Louisa's cabin in February with his eldest son, who was studying at the Carlisle School, and who had the technical vocabulary to ask questions Eliza's husband did not know to ask. The son pressed his palm over the interior grate, and felt the air temperature, and asked about the trench depth, and the tube diameter, and the length, and the intake positioning. Louisa answered each question from the notebook, which had the specific numbers. The son said, "This is a heat exchanger." Louisa said, "I do not know that word." He said, "It is a device that transfers heat from one medium to another. In this case, from the soil to the air. It is described in some German engineering literature, but I had not seen it applied to a farmstead air intake before." Louisa said, "I found it at the root cellar hatch." He looked at her. He said, "I beg your pardon." She said, "I noticed the warm air rising from the root cellar opening in December, and I worked backward from what I observed to what I could build." The engineering literature you mention may have arrived at the same place by a different path. He was quiet. He said, "Would you show me the diagram you drew in December of 1861? She showed him. He studied it for a long time. He copied it into his own notebook, which he had brought with dimensions. He said, "This is precisely correct as drawn. The air path, the depth, the length, the convective flow mechanism. You derived this from observation," she said, "from the root cellar hatch, and from thinking about what the observation implied." He said, "Without reference to any published description." She said, "Without any published description, yes." He said nothing for a while. He copied the remaining specifications from her notebook. His father had been looking at the diagram over his shoulder, and now said to his son, "Will you help me build one of these?" The son said, "Yes." He turned to Louisa. "Would you supervise?" Bree said, "At my standard rate for farm consultation work, yes." He asked what her rate was. She named it. He agreed without hesitation, which told her the rate was fair and possibly slightly low, and she revised it upward for the next person who asked. By the winter of 1863, 4 farmsteads in the Cumberland Valley had buried air intake tubes. By the winter of 1865, 11. The son from the Carlisle School, his name was Thomas Mast, and he was 19 in 1862 and would go on to study engineering at Philadelphia, had written a short account of the Earth's tube intake for the Pennsylvania Farmer Journal in the spring of 1863, which he submitted with Louisa's permission and which attributed the design to her observation at the root cellar hatch in December of 1861. The journal published it. The account was read by farmers in 3 Pennsylvania counties. Several of them built variations on the design using clay tile, iron pipe, or brick-lined channels rather than hollowed poplar, the material varying with what was available and affordable. The principle remaining the same: 25 feet underground at 4 feet depth, passive convective flow, incoming air preheated to near earth temperature before entering the room. The variants that used clay tile were more durable than the poplar sections and outlasted them by decades. Louisa's poplar sections needed replacement in 1871. 9 years after installation, when one section split under the soil pressure and admitted soil into the air path. She replaced it with clay tiles she had traded for with the neighboring German family who made them, the Ritters, who had a kiln and who accepted 2 weeks of her market garden produce as the trade price. She replaced the failed section and continued using the tube for another 19 years. Until her death in 1890 at the age of 73, the tube was still functioning when she died. The air at the interior grate was still coming through at 42 to 44 degrees in December, slightly reduced from the 43 she had measured in 1862 because the poplar sections she had not replaced had degraded marginally over the years, but still providing 30 or more degrees of preheating on the coldest days. 30 degrees of preheating from a buried tube of poplar and iron, for $3 in 3 days of digging and a winter of hollowing. She had noticed the warm air at the root cellar hatch in December of 1861 and had followed the observation to its conclusion, which was a tube in the ground and a grate in the north sill and 43 degrees. Instead of 8, coming through it on the December mornings, when the Pennsylvania winter made 8 degrees feel like the temperature the world had decided to stay at until March. The world had decided. She had put the tube in the ground and changed what the world's decision cost her. The physics of the earth tube air preheater require careful description because the mechanism is less intuitive than wall insulation or stove efficiency, and the neighbors who called it cheap and useless were making a reasonable error about what the tube was doing and what it was not doing. The tube was not a heater. It could not produce heat. It could only transfer heat that already existed, the heat stored in the earth at 4 feet of depth, which was the 45 degrees that the earth maintained year-round at that depth for the same reason that Mabel Hennessy's pit dwelling in Indiana was 50 degrees in a January blizzard. The earth at 4 feet responded to the annual average air temperature, not to the daily or seasonal variation of the surface. What the tube did was bring that existing earth heat into contact with the cold outside air that was being drawn into the cabin. The cold outside air, entering the intake, above ground, traveled through the tube at 4 feet of depth 425 feet. During that travel, the cold air was in contact with the tube walls. The tube walls were in contact with the surrounding soil. The soil was 45 degrees. The cold air absorbed heat from the tube walls and from the soil through the tube walls, rising in temperature as it traveled. The rate of temperature rise depended on the diameter of the tube, the length, the depth, and the velocity of the airflow. Smaller diameter meant more surface area per volume of air, more heat transfer per foot of travel. Longer length meant more time in contact, more total heat transferred. Greater depth meant warmer surrounding soil, more temperature differential driving the transfer. Slower velocity meant more contact time per foot. Louisa's tube was 4 inches in interior diameter, 25 feet long, at 4 feet of depth. With a passive convective flow rate that she estimated from the movement of a candle flame held over the grate. The result was a 35-degree rise in April soil conditions and a 35-degree rise in December soil conditions. The rise being consistent because the soil temperature at 4 feet was consistent. The neighbor's error was thinking about what the tube was not doing rather than what it was doing. A heater produces heat. The tube does not produce heat. Therefore, the neighbors concluded, the tube is not a heater and cannot affect the cabin temperature. The error was in the premise. The cabin's warmth was not limited by the stove's heat production capacity, which was adequate. The cabin's warmth was limited by the rate at which cold infiltrating air was diluting the stove's output. The stove produced heat at a certain rate. The infiltrating cold air, at 8 degrees, required that rate plus a surplus to maintain the room at 60 degrees. The stove was working at the edge of its capacity just to offset the cold load that 8-degree infiltration created. Change the infiltration temperature from 8 degrees to 43 degrees and the cold load drops by 35 degrees. The same stove, working at the same rate, now has a surplus it can apply to raising the room temperature, or it can be reduced in output to save fuel while maintaining the same temperature. She had applied the surplus to fuel saving rather than to higher room temperature, which was the economically rational choice for a woman burning 4 cords a month in a cold Pennsylvania winter. The tube had freed 35 degrees worth of stove capacity from the task of heating, infiltrating air, and she had used that freed capacity to burn 1.5 fewer cords per month. This was the arithmetic the neighbors had not done. They had evaluated the tube as a heating device and found it wanting. It was not a heating device. It was a load reduction device. It reduced the cold load the stove had to offset. The same stove, reduced load, less fuel. $3 of iron. 25 feet of hollowed poplar. 3 days of digging. 35 degrees of load reduction. 1.5 cords per month of fuel savings. At Pennsylvania wood prices, in 1862, 1.5 cords per month was approximately $3 per month in fuel savings. The tube paid for itself in the first month of winter operation. In the 9 years before the first poplar section needed replacement, it had saved approximately $150 in fuel at 1862 prices, $150 from a $3 investment and a winter of evenings hollowing poplar. The neighbors who called it cheap and useless had evaluated the wrong variable. It was cheap. It was not useless. It was the most cost-effective improvement she made to the Oberholt cabin. More cost-effective than the window sealing she did in 1863, and the floor gap caulking she did in 1864, and the second layer of boards she added to the north wall in 1865. All of those improvements helped. None of them approached the ratio of cost to fuel savings that the earth tube provided. The earth did the work. It had always been doing the work. She had connected the cabin to what the earth was already doing, and the earth had kept doing it for 28 years without requiring anything from her except that she'll keep the intake cap clear of snow in the heavy November storms. She kept the intake clear. The earth kept warming the air. The stove kept doing less work to accomplish the same result. That was the whole mechanism. That was what the $3 had bought. The winter of hollowing the poplar sections from October of 1861 through February of 1862 is worth describing in physical sequence, because the work itself contains several problems that she solved in the process and that informed the design decisions she made during installation. The first problem was the diameter. She had planned a 4-inch interior diameter as adequate for the passive flow rate the convective pressure would produce. The first section she hollowed, the 10-foot poplar log she worked in October, produced a channel approximately 3.5 inches in diameter at the narrow section and 5 inches at the wide section. Because the natural taper of the log was more pronounced than she had estimated, she tested the assembled section by breathing into one end and observing whether she could feel the airflow at the other end. She could not, which told her that the narrow section was restricting the flow below the level she needed. She reworked the narrow section with a longer chisel, working from both ends, and brought the minimum diameter to 4 inches throughout the section length. The rework took a full day. She added a note to the working sequence she was keeping, gauge to 4 inches minimum before checking the section. The minimum controls the flow, not the average. The minimum controls the flow. This was the principle she had derived from the breathing test, which was the right test for that purpose. Any constriction below the minimum diameter would reduce the flow rate for the full length of the tube, regardless of how adequate all the other sections were. One undersized section negated the adequate sizing of the others. She applied this test to every section she made after the first, breathing in from one end and feeling the flow at the other before she accepted the section. Each section that failed the test she reworked until it passed. This added time but removed uncertainty about whether the assembled tube would flow adequately. The second problem was the joint between sections. She had planned to seal the paired halves of each log section with clay and to join adjacent sections end to end with a clay-sealed butt joint, the clay sealing the soil from entering the air path. The first assembled section she tested by submersing a short length in the mill pond and checking whether air bubbled through the joint seals under water pressure. Air bubbled through the butt joint between two sections. The clay seal was not holding at the joint under pressure. She re-examined the butt joint geometry. To cut ends of poplar, the grain exposed, butted together, and sealed with clay. The grain was absorbing the clay rather than holding it at the surface, and the clay dried and contracted away from the grain face, leaving a microscopic gap that the water pressure found. She solved this by wrapping the butt joints with wet rawhide strips, which dried tight and waterproof over the clay fill. The rawhide joint was stronger than the clay alone and did not require perfect clay adhesion to the wood grain. She retested the section with the rawhide wrap in the mill pond and found no bubbling. She adopted the rawhide wrap for all but joints in the remaining sections. The third problem was the intake cap design. She had planned a simple bent iron cap that faced downward to prevent snow entry, the same cap form used on chimney terminals to prevent rain entry. She realized in December, before installation, that a downward-facing cap on an intake tube was the wrong orientation for the passive convective flow she was depending on. The flow was driven by the temperature differential between the cold outdoor air and the warmer air in the buried section. The cold outdoor air, denser than the warmer air, would naturally flow inward and downward into the tube. A downward-facing cap would interrupt this natural flow by forcing the incoming air to reverse direction at the intake. A side-facing cap that allowed air to enter horizontally would work with the natural flow rather than against it. She changed the cap orientation from downward-facing to side-facing, the opening pointing away from the prevailing north wind to prevent backdraft, while allowing the natural downward-dinward flow to proceed without redirection. The change required bending the iron cap differently, which she did at the farmhouse smithy in February using the small forge Friedrich had built for tool repair. She had used the forge for tool repair since Friedrich died. She was competent with it for the specific repairs that came up on a farm, the retempering of tools and the straightening of bent implements, though not competent for the fine ironwork that a professional blacksmith would do. The cap bending was within her competence. She bent the cap correctly on the third attempt, the first two being the wrong angle or the wrong bend radius. She had not done cap bending before, and she arrived at the correct form by trial with scrap iron of the same gauge. Before committing to the iron, she would install trial with scrap before committing to the good material. This was the same principle her father had used in his joinery work, which she had absorbed by watching without being taught explicitly. The same principle that every careful craftsperson discovers independently and that saves the same quantity of wasted material in every generation. She installed the tube in March of 1862 with 3 sections of hollowed and sealed poplar, 1 iron section through the north sill, and an iron cap of the correct orientation at the outdoor intake. The installation took 4 days, 3 for the trench and 1 for laying the sections and backfilling. The April test confirmed passive flow. The December test confirmed 35 degrees of preheating. She had made every major design decision correctly, including the 2 she had made by solving problems she discovered during the hollowing work, and the tube operated as designed from its first winter through the last winter of her life. 28 years without a failure she had not been able to correct. 1 section replaced in 1871 when the poplar split. The rest original. The work in October through February had been careful work done alone in the evenings, the adze and chisel on the split poplar halves, the breathing test for each section, the millpond test for each joint, the cap bending by trial on scrap iron. 4 months of evenings, producing 3 sections of tube that worked for 28 years. She had been careful. The careful work held. Thomas Mast's account in the Pennsylvania Farmer Journal in the spring of 1863 deserves examination because it shows how knowledge that originates from practical observation becomes transmissible through formal channels, and because the account itself is more careful about attribution than was common for technical journal pieces of the period. Thomas had been 19 when he came to the Henkel farm in February of 1862 with his father and his notebook. He had heard from his mother about the buried pipe that warmed Louisa Henkel's cabin, and he had come prepared to be skeptical because the claim, as his mother described it, a buried pipe warming a cabin, did not correspond to anything he had encountered in his reading. What he found was not what he had expected. He had expected a simple device that someone without technical understanding had attached a warming claim to. He found instead a device that he recognized. After examining it and measuring it and questioning Louisa about her reasoning, as a correct application of the earth heat exchange principle that appeared in some German agricultural engineering texts he had subsequently located in the Carlisle School Library. He had not located these texts before visiting because he had not expected to need them. He located them afterward because he wanted to understand how a woman farming alone in rural Elso, Pennsylvania, had arrived at a design that corresponded to German engineering literature she had never read. His account in the Pennsylvania Farmer described the device in specific technical terms, including the earth tube designation he had brought from the engineering literature. It described the installation dimensions, the poplar construction method, the passive convective flow mechanism, and the measured fuel savings. It attributed the design explicitly to Louisa Henkel of Cumberland County and described her reasoning from the root cellar hatch observation, which he had found the most interesting element of the account. He wrote, "The designer of this device arrived at the earth tube air intake principle through direct observation rather than through consultation of engineering literature in which a similar principle appears. The observation was made at the entrance of a root cellar in December, and the connection to the cabin heating problem was made through a chain of reasoning that proceeded from what was observed to what it implied to what could be built to act on the implication. The device she constructed, at a cost of $3 for iron components and labor only for the remainder, has produced measurable and documented fuel savings over 2 winters of operation." He was careful to say what the device cost and what it produced. He was careful to attribute the origin of the design to the specific observation that produced it. He was careful to distinguish between the THO observation-based design and the engineering literature that independently described a similar principle. Because the independence of the two developments was interesting, and because attributing her design to the literature would have been inaccurate, the journal published the account with a short editor's note that said the device described was an instance of practical ingenuity that merited wider attention, and that readers who wished to construct similar devices were encouraged to correspond with Thomas Mast at the Carlisle address he had provided for questions. Louisa had given Thomas permission to publish before he submitted the account, and he had shown her the draft, which she had read carefully and corrected in one place. He had the tube diameter as 5 inches in an early draft, which she corrected to 4 inches, the minimum controlling the flow, and approved otherwise. Her correction of the 5-inch diameter was the kind of correction that only the person who had built the device could make. The person who had learned from the first section's failing mill pond test that the minimum diameter controlled the flow, and that the minimum she had achieved was 4 inches, not 5. Thomas had not made the device. He had measured the installed device, which had a 5-inch exterior diameter at some points, and had written 5 inches. He had measured the wrong dimension. She corrected it. He submitted the corrected version. The published account said 4 inches. The 11 farmsteads that had adopted the design by 1865 included some who had built from Thomas's journal account, and some who had come to Louisa directly through the word-of-mouth networks of the Cumberland Valley farming community. The ones who came to Louisa got the detail about the minimum diameter, and the breathing test, and the rawhide joint wrap, and the side-facing cap orientation. The ones who built from the journal account got the general principle and the dimensions, but not the specific solutions to the problems she had discovered during construction. 2 of the journal account builders had difficulties in the first winter, one with a tube that flowed inadequately because of an undersized section, and one with a cap that faced downward and interrupted the natural flow. Both came to Louisa after the first winter to understand why their tubes underperformed. Both understood the problem when she explained it. Both corrected it before the second winter. She added the breathing test and the cap orientation to the notes she gave to subsequent builders, which were more complete than the notes she had given the first wave of builders who had come before the problems had appeared. The notes improved with each builder who discovered a problem she had not anticipated and who came back to report it. This was the same process that had improved Nora Walsh's chinking instructions in Oregon, when Ida Stroud added the corner wedding note from her own experience. The instructions started as what the originator knew. They became better as each subsequent builder added what they learned to what they passed on. By 1866, Louisa's notes for building the earth tube air intake were 4 pages long, covering the hollowing technique, the minimum diameter test, the mill pond joint test, the cap orientation, the trench depth, the backfill sequence, and the intake positioning relative to the prevailing wind. The 4 pages were a record of every problem she and the 11 farmsteads had encountered and solved. She had started with a diagram and a page of specifications. She had ended with 4 pages of specific knowledge accumulated from 13 installations, each installation contributing something the previous ones had not encountered. The knowledge had grown. The tubes were working. The Pennsylvania winter had been paying for the 3DL iron investment since 1862. The earth had been doing its part since long before 1862 and would continue doing it long after. The Pennsylvania State Historical Society holds Louisa Henkel's notebook in its collection, donated by her granddaughter. In 1921, the notebook covers 31 years of farm records from 1859 through 1890. And the December 1861 entries are the ones that historical accounts of her work return to most often, because they show the reasoning from observation to design in real time. The entry for December 14, 1861, the day after the root cellar hatch observation, reads, "Root cellar entrance warms incoming air from below. Ground at 4 feet maintains 45 degrees regardless of surface temperature. Air traveling through buried tube at 4 feet depth would warm by contact with tube walls and surrounding soil. If tube runs from outdoor intake to cabin north sill at 4 feet depth, 425 feet, incoming air would arrive at near earth temperature rather than at outdoor temperature. Stove load would decrease proportionally. No fuel required for the preheating. Earth provides it." 6 sentences. Written the day after she opened the hatch and felt the warm air rising. The observation on December 13th. The design on December 14th. The reasoning completed overnight. She had been in the process of solving the cold cabin problem since October. She had made notes in October and November about the infiltration patterns and the fuel consumption and the various sealing approaches she had tried. She had been building toward a solution for 2 months when the root cellar hatch provided the final piece. The final piece was not a solution in itself. It was an observation that made a solution visible. The observation was that underground air was warm. The solution was to run the cabin's incoming air through underground space before it entered the room. The observation made the solution visible. Because she had been thinking about the cold air infiltration problem for 2 months, and the observation slotted into that thinking as the answer to the question she had been working on. She wrote the 6 sentences on December 14th, and she acted on them in March and the tube she built from those 6 sentences was working in the November of that year and was still working when she died in 1890. 31 years of notebooks, 6 sentences in December, 1 tube in the ground. The warm air at the root cellar hatch had been there every December since the root cellar was built, which was before she bought the Oberholt land. The previous owners had not noticed it, or had not connected it to the cold infiltration problem, or both. She noticed it in December of 1861 and connected it on December 14th. This is the thing that the account of practical knowledge always returns to. The observation is only the first step. Many people see the same thing and do not connect it to anything. The connection requires that the person has been thinking about a problem that the observation addresses, and that when the observation arrives, the thinking is in a state to receive it. She had been thinking about the cold infiltration problem since October. She had been at the root cellar hatch every week for the 2 months she had been on the Oberholt land, going to get stored vegetables. She had walked past the open hatch a dozen times in those 2 months without stopping. On December 13th, she stopped. The problem she had been working on for 2 months was the reason she stopped. The observation was the same observation. It had always been warm air rising from the root cellar, but on December 13th, she had the problem ready to receive it. Ready to receive. This is the epistemology of the December 14th 6 sentences. Not genius. Not accident. The prepared mind meeting the observation at the moment the observation was useful. She had prepared her mind for 2 months by thinking carefully about the cold cabin problem. The root cellar hatch provided the observation. December 14th produced the 6 sentences. March produced the tube. November produced the result. $3. 25 feet of hollowed poplar. 4 months of evenings. 1 winter of warmth, followed by 27 more. The earth had been 45 degrees at 4 feet of depth since before she arrived on the land. It would be 45 degrees at 4 feet of depth long after the land was gone. She had connected the cabin to that temperature for $3 and a winter of careful work, and the connection had held until she died. The prepared mind, the ready observation, the 6 sentences. That was where the warm cabin began. That was always where it began. There is one more conversation from the record that deserves its place in the account, which is the exchange between Louisa and Eliza Mast in January of 1862 that has been partially described but not fully rendered. Eliza had said, "My husband will say it is a woman's fancy." Louisa had said, "Show him the fuel numbers from my November and December." This exchange contains something specific about how Louisa understood the relationship between her knowledge and the skepticism she knew it would encounter. She did not respond to the anticipated dismissal by explaining the mechanism or arguing for its validity or expressing frustration. She responded by identifying the evidence that would convert the skeptic. The fuel numbers. The fuel numbers from November and December, showing 4 cords in November without the tube and 2.5 cords in December with it, were the argument that she could not defeat by dismissing as fancy. The fuel numbers were the numbers, and the numbers were not disputable. And a man who had been burning for cords a month and was offered a device that reduced the consumption to 2.5 without any other change would not dismiss the numbers as fancy unless he was willing to pay for the dismissal in wood. Eliza's husband was not willing to pay for it. He came to the farm. He examined the tube. He asked about the cost. He asked Thomas to show him the engineering principle. He built his own tube in the spring, and his fuel consumption the following December was 2.5 cords. The fuel numbers had converted him. Not the mechanism, explanation, which he had received from Thomas, and which he had found difficult to fully credit until he saw the numbers. Not Louisa's reputation or authority, which he respected, but which could have been mistaken. The fuel numbers from 2 winters of documented operation. She had known this would be the case. She had been keeping the fuel numbers since Friedrich died precisely because the numbers were the argument and the argument needed to be documented before it would be accepted by the people who would benefit from it. Documented evidence persuades where explanation alone does not. This is not a principle she had written down or would have named if asked. It was how she operated. The notebook full of measurements was the evidence, and the evidence was what moved the skeptics. And the skeptics were the people who most needed to be moved, because they were the ones who would otherwise spend the winter burning for cords and calling buried pipes useless. She had spent 30 years documenting what she observed and what the observations produced and what the results were. The notebook was the accumulation of that documentation. The accumulation was the argument. The argument held. The fuel numbers held. The earth tube held. 11 farmsteads warm by 1865. 4 pages of refined instructions by 1866. The Pennsylvania Farmer Journal account in 1863, which reached 3 counties and moved the numbers Thomas had documented from her notebook into the hands of farmers she would never meet. $3.28 years. The earth 45 degrees at 4 feet. She had opened the root cellar hatch in December of 1861 and felt the warm air. And stopped and thought about what it meant, and the tube had been in the ground and functioning by the following November, 28 winters. The earth held what she had connected to it. That was what it had become. That was what the $3 and the buried tube and the prepared mind had been worth. The warm air had always been there. She had given it somewhere to go. The 4 pages of building instructions that Louisa had assembled by 1866 were not her final word on the subject. She continued refining them through the 1870s as the design spread to new soil conditions and new construction types and new climates within Pennsylvania that produced variations she had not encountered in the Cumberland Valley. The most significant addition came from a builder in Lancaster County, who wrote to her in 1873 after building a tube in heavier clay soil than the sandy loam of the Cumberland Valley. The clay soil held more moisture than the loam and conducted heat to the traveling air more efficiently because water conducts heat better than dry soil. His tube was only 15 feet long and was producing the same 35 degrees of preheating that her 25-foot tube produced in the drier soil. She wrote back to him, asking for specific measurements: soil type, tube length, tube diameter, inlet and outlet temperatures at a specified outdoor temperature, and he provided them. She added a section to her instructions, noting that clay soil might allow a shorter tube to produce equivalent preheating, and that builders in heavy soil should test a shorter installation before committing to the full 25-foot length. The instruction she had started with a single design was becoming a conditional instruction. Different recommendations for different conditions. This was the right direction for any practical knowledge to move. From the specific experience of one builder in one place to the generalized principle that accounted for the variation in conditions that different builders in different places would face. She was 71 when she received the Lancaster County letter and wrote back. She had been keeping the notebook for 31 years, and this was the last entry. She made that reflected a design change rather than simply a measurement. January 4, 1872. Lancaster County builder reports 15 feet in heavy clay soil, producing 35-degree preheating, equivalent to 25 feet in loam. Soil moisture content affects heat transfer rate. Recommend shorter test installation in heavy clay before committing to full length. Will add 2 instructions. She added it to the instructions. The instructions were 5 pages by 1873. The 5 pages were what she had given to every builder who came to her after that year. And they were better instructions than the 4 pages had been, and the 4 pages had been better than the 1 page she had started with, and the 1 page had been better than the six sentences in December of 1861. The 6 sentences were the beginning. The 5 pages were where 30 years of building from them had arrived. She had felt the warm air in December of 1861. 30 years later, the instructions for connecting a cabin to that warm air were 5 pages of specific, tested, conditional knowledge that accounted for different soil types and different tube materials and different intake orientations and the specific problems that 13 years of Cumberland Valley builders had encountered and solved. The warm air at the root cellar hatch had been there every December. She had felt it once, in December of 1861. With the cold infiltration problem in her thinking and the prepared mind ready to receive what the observation had to offer, it had offered 30 years of warm cabins and 5 pages of instructions and $150 in fuel savings per tube per decade, and the knowledge that the earth at 4 feet depth was 45 degrees and would remain 45 degrees regardless of what the Pennsylvania winter decided to do at the surface. $3. The earth did the rest. The earth had always been doing it. She had simply given it a path into the room.